Chapter 7. Angelique's Travels. Standing alongside Karnak, Angelique recognized feelings she had long ago lost. Even though they had been very young, they were the purest of emotions, emotions she had replaced with the military and her career with Homeland Security. She often believed that is what propelled her through the ranks. Now looking into his green eyes, she thought about how her career was long gone. But that didn't bother her. She was now standing once again next to the man she had thought of all these years. Many times she had thought of finding him, mostly out of curiosity, to see what kind of man he had become. Looking at him now as he stood before her, she wished she had. Moments like this were very difficult, especially as she never thought this would be happening. She now had the man of her dreams within reach, and she was leaving him to embark on a long journey, one to find her parents. Even though it was due to the same man standing before her that her parents had been taken. She marveled at how history, be it centuries or a lifespan, seemed to bring things full circle. Now it was time to say goodbye and begin what she hoped would be a short time apart. Watching as he stepped closer to reach out to her, she couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the rugged man he had become. Even with his hard, macho, warrior exterior, she could still see the love he had for her. She had seen it. The moment their eyes met once again in the woods behind her parents' place, the man who had changed her life was once more wrapping his arms around her and pulling her tight. Angelique thought about nothing else in the world that was now falling down around them, but the warmth and touch of his body as she turned her head, meeting him face to face. Hypnotized, they stared into each other's eyes as she tried with all her might to remember this moment right before their lips battled it out, a battle unlike most because she never wanted it to end. Each had to dig deep to muster all the strength they had to end the kiss and resist the urge for one more. As her feelings began to overtake her, and she moved in for another kiss, she heard somebody approaching, which gave her the strength to resist. That was the problem with being in love with the leader of a growing militia. Others seemed to need him as much as she did, but in a much different way. Angelique watched as her love took a step back and turned to find out what the runner needed. She could still not believe they were once again together, and the sound of his voice caused her to want him more. She watched as Karnak faced the runner. "What can I do for you?" With those words, her ears began to ring, as she watched what seemed to be red spray escaping from different points of his back, and with each one, her ears rang louder. Fear and panic rushed through her body as she watched her love fall backward to the ground as more spray came from all over. Quickly drawing her twin Colts and turning to the man who was still firing, she raised the guns only to feel pressure in her midsection. Fighting with all her might, she watched as her hands released the pistols and began to lower to her sides. With her energy quickly draining, she looked over at Karnak, lying bloodied on the ground. Her one thought as everything grew quiet and night began to fall even faster was to get to him. Calling up all her energy, she felt herself take a step as her legs began to give beneath her. As she fell, her last thought was of the kiss they had just shared. Rising up slightly and gasping for air, Angelique awakened from the nightmare that had plagued her since parting with Karnak to search for her parents. Quickly, she looked around in the dim glow of the moonlight shining through the windows of the abandoned bus where they slept. After spotting the guard near the front of the bus with his back to her, she was sure her secret was safe as she slowly lowered back into the seat. Now, as many nights before, she thought about the dream for a few minutes and then tried getting a little more sleep. Sleep after waking from the dream hadn't happened before, and knowing that it would most likely be the same now, she decided to relieve Ken. One thing she didn't want to do was waste time trying to sleep when someone else could. She rose slowly from the relative comfort of the seat and checked that her Colts were still where they should be before making her way to the front. Approaching Ken from behind, who was watching and listening for movement through the front of the bus, Angelique cleared her throat to alert him to her presence. "Can't sleep? Nightmare again?" Ken asked with a hint of concern, even in the whisper of a voice he used. He knew her well enough to know she didn't like others to be aware that something had scared her. "Don't worry. Everyone has them, and I'm probably the only one who knows." Angelique was at a loss for words. She didn't want to talk about her nightmares, so she did what anyone would do. She changed the subject as if it didn't bother her. "Anything out there?" Knowing what she was doing, Ken rolled with the subject change. "Thought I saw movement about an hour ago, but around here it could have very well been a deer or a possum or who knows." "The bike's still secure?" "From what I can see, which isn't a great deal." The motorcycles they had been using sat facing the front of the bus, with a half-inch stainless steel cable running through the front tires that was locked to the bus. From day one of the EMP, everyone understood that transportation was something many would do anything to acquire. "Okay. Before I relieve you, I want to go have a look." With a pat on Ken's shoulder, she quietly exited the bus as he watched her and the area around her closely. Because there were only 3 of them, Angelique, Ken, and Todd, nobody went off by themselves, and that meant even off the bus to check the bikes without somebody keeping watch. After a few minutes spent checking the cable, looking around, listening, and smelling the air for anything that might be lurking, Angelique made her way back to the bus. "Anything?" It's hard to believe how quickly people turned on one another when the power went out. Just by the 3rd day, the smell of decomposing bodies began to fill the air. Now it's pretty much the norm. Ken understood all too well what she was saying. They had been on the road for 5 days now, making their way to St. Louis. A trip that just weeks ago could have been made in about 3 hours now took 6. More than once they stopped at towns where society had broken down so far that the dead lay all over and fires burned uncontrollably. Panic and hysteria had quickly become the new normal. "I have it from here. It'll be light in a few hours. See if you can get some rest," Angelique told Ken, as she fixed her vision on the areas off in the distance, while keeping a hand resting atop a Colt. Time passed slowly as Angelique watched for movement in the darkness. It was hard to know just how much time, as the items that kept time were few. Nevertheless, she could tell the sun was beginning to rise, and to her that meant one thing. It was time to wake the other 2. Knowing that historically attacks happened at the break of dawn, the 3 never slept through a sunrise. It was as if the sunrise was their own galactic alarm clock, and it was 1 point out of 3 in a day when they were certain of the time. Waking for them wasn't a drawn-out process as it was for many. After years in the military, they rose to meet the day with a slight acknowledgement that it was time. Angelique simply reached back with the hand not resting on her pistol and slapped the padding of the seat behind her twice. Todd awakened within seconds, checking his equipment. Ken followed, doing much of the same. Assured the 2 were up and moving from her observations using the mirror above the windshield, she once more focused on the area outside the bus. There she watched as the wildlife moved about as if nothing in the world had changed, and except for the fact that very few became roadkill on a daily basis, nothing had. Within minutes, the other 2 in her party were ready to move. It didn't take long due to the little baggage they had brought with them. The morning began as every other since their departure with the fueling of the motorcycles. Fuel wasn't hard to come by, as all around there were vehicles with fuel in their tanks. With so few in operation, the cars sat as fueling stations for those who could hold on to their transportation. With a makeshift hand pump designed for pumping water from an aquarium, they set about the process. As they pumped, they all scanned the area around them, searching for threats. Avoiding populated areas had helped keep them from the never-ending carnage. Today, however, there would be no avoiding such areas, a fact that had become evident as other people began to appear with the fading darkness. "That explains the noises we were hearing," Ken said, answering a question that none of them had asked. Each of them checked their weapons as Todd finished screwing the caps back on the gas tanks. With eyes watching for any signs that the approaching people may pose a threat, all 3 had the feeling this scene had played out once before. Todd was the first to bring up what they were all thinking. Do they look like refugees running from a war to anybody else? I was thinking the same thing, except for the trees and grass. This looks like what I saw in the Middle East as villagers ran for their lives, leaving everything. Ken was shocked by the resemblance of the two events. The more he watched as they passed by not saying a word, the more sorrow he felt for his fellow countrymen. "We need to get some intel and find out what they're all running from," Todd suggested to the others, who nodded in agreement. Angelique watched as a mother caring for her crying baby walked alone just yards away. She was filled with desire to help her, yet knew she could do nothing to relieve her obvious anguish. Todd questioned a few who passed nearby with little in the way of response. Most did their best to avoid the three, and those who walked close by were in such a state of shock that they simply headed in the same direction as the masses. "What in the hell is going on?" Todd asked the other two in frustration. Feeling frustrated herself, Angelique looked around and called out, "Can one of you tell us what all of this is about?" Two men heading their way stopped, just as they were about to veer away from the three. They talked for a brief period while adjusting their packs. It was clear that one didn't want to have anything to do with the two wearing black and gray uniforms, or the woman who wore the same style military pants, but with a tight black t-shirt. As the two began walking over, Angelique noticed that they were more aware of their surroundings than the others who had previously walked by in shock. Stopping no closer than 10 feet away from any of the three, the two looked like wild animals preparing to run from a predator. Seconds ticked by as the two men stood adjusting what little baggage they carried without saying a word. Ken, Todd, and Angelique looked at one another, unsure if they should speak for fear of the two bolting like rabbits. "Where is everyone heading?" Angelique finally spoke after the three communicated silently among themselves that she would be the best to start. The more hesitant of the two men looked as if he were already running, only not actually going anywhere. The other reluctantly began to speak. "Who are you?" Angelique glanced over at the others and then back at the guy. "We are the United Constitutional Militia." "Who?" the man asked, puzzled. "Never heard of you." "We are new. Now what is all of this?" Angelique wasn't in the mood to tell the whole story of the last month to the guy. "How do you not know?" the guy asked again, confused by every question. Todd couldn't restrain himself from jumping into the conversation any longer. "Listen, we are from a few hundred miles west of here, heading to the Robert Young Federal Building on Spruce Street. You can't go there!" the man snapped back, cutting him off. All three looked at one another, surprised by the fear in his response. "Why?" Todd asked, as he began to hear the roar of a jet approaching. Everyone looked down the highway in the direction of the sound. "So the Air Force is still out there. I didn't think they would all be gone from the EMP." Ken still watched the sky with the others, but looked down to ask the guy another question only to see that he and everyone else were gone. "I don't know what is going on here, but it cannot be good." Surprised by the absence of all the people who had just been there, Ken reached out and tapped Todd and Angelique to draw their attention from the sky. As the two looked down, the sight was eerie. Not one person remained on the highway except them. The sound of the jet grew closer as they turned their attention back to the sky. Off in the distance, they watched the jet head in their direction. As it neared, Todd suggested, "Maybe we should make ourselves a little less exposed until we find out why everyone ran." Without any debate, they ducked down behind one of the many abandoned vehicles and watched the jet as it grew near. Seconds passed as it came closer. "It can't be," Todd said with surprise and horror. "Can't be what?" both Angelique and Ken asked at the same time. "I think I know why everyone was running." Just as Angelique and Ken questioned how he knew, they watched as the jet flew low overhead. They spotted a large red Chinese star painted on its wings, which gave them all the answers they needed. "Yeah, got it," Angelique said in disbelief.